All right, it's going to be just a little mini lecture here on Steven Pinker's. I think "Violence Vanquished" is the title. And actually, hang on a sec. It's from. Oh, sorry about that. This is the book. It's actually from. It's called "Better Angels of Our Nature." And it really is probably one of the biggest, bigger, and more important books in the nonfiction works to probably come out in the last 20 years or so. Huge, had a huge impact on the culture actually. And I think when it came out, people still were sort of assuming, that violence has just gotten worse. And boy, a lot of people. I'll tell you what, it seems like my young students are actually better about this than say my parents, who were my mother's constantly thinks that the world is just a becoming an increasingly gloomy and dark and more dangerous place. And I tell you what, to be fair, as I'm recording this in the late September 2020, the last 6 months, it does feel like this country has kind of slid back into almost an atavistic kind of chaos. But even still, it is important. We're so much less violent, and kids are so much safer now than they were then. And he actually, Pinker breaks this down as a much longer term trend. And again, we're moving on now to our research papers, right? And boy, is this a clinic on, say, historical research, and really, almost certainly beyond what. Um, Anyway, well, not almost certainly, absolutely beyond what any of you were going to do, because this was a doorstop of a book. I think it's what is it, about I think almost 700 pages before that, and then another couple hundred pages in notes. What he did was just kind of compile literature, all the literature you could find on violence, and sort of anthropologists that study these things, and major historians that study these things, and then kind of sort of satellited, sort of extracted out, or went out from there. But essentially from the dawn of man till now, when he sort of comes up with sort of I think it was six major thresholds, sort of historical thresholds of decline. Um, uh, um, Historically, and the first, I guess, was about 5,000 years. You can, again, I won't go point by point here, but the beginning, especially about I think what 5,000 years ago, I believe it was basically not long after, although that's still a few thousand years after, as far as I know. Domesticated agriculture, and the sort of civil. What happens when human beings domesticate agriculture? They stop roaming around so much. They sort of settle into one place. You settle into one place and stay there. You got to figure out a way to get along, and so they do. And apparently, it went from 15% of human beings dying of violent deaths down to about 3. You're going from a pre-state to sort of, again, these are the first sort of city states you get, and that's one of the major. I'll get into the basically the pacifying forces that did this in a second. One of those would have been, of course, once you have a sort of so you start getting a sort of governance. The governance kind of monopolizes the right to violence. You get the first sort of bits of law and order, or first drafts of law and order and codified law and things like that, all of which helps dampen down violence. Um, Essentially, once you get, well, again, I'll get that back at that in a second, in a little more detail. The second one, I think it was late Middle Ages into the 20th century, which again, I guess was a 10 to 50-fold decline, is how what he said. And again, centralized authority, more commerce, which is another one of the main forces that help pacify human beings, um, and people having to increasingly cooperate because they are staying in sort of one place. You get the Enlightenment that he credits as well, where you start getting more gentle governments and less capital crime, blood sports, and the gladiators and things like that in the Colosseum, fighting lions and when everyone watching them get maimed. Again, these things are still sort of in us, right? A lot of us love to watch the UFC or even some of the sports we watch, whether it's hockey or the NFL, the huge, kind of dangerous looking hits. Often seem to draw just as big a cheer as the the goals or the touchdowns, right? The long peace is basically from there on out. You get what he called the long peace was the fourth one, which was growth of democracy and trade and international organizations, and especially and then the new piece following that, which is essentially the decline of communism, which really was a bloody and which I do think there's been some disturbing flirtations with things like socialism and communism from some people, basically of the political left in this country, that I find kind of disturbing. They ought to maybe read some history books, but anyway, the demise of communism. Adolf Hitler, right, killed, I think it was 9 million, which is, I mean, it's hard to get your head around such a number, right? Killing 9 million people. But, Stalin, I think it was, I've seen numbers as high as 100 million. Certainly in the deca millions, the tens of millions of people he killed, and I don't know how many of them just in his own gulags. I mean, there's the Red Famine. There's again, you read about it sometime. Killed way more people in total than Hitler. Somehow it wasn't quite as bizarre and gruesome in the way with the master race and that sort of thing. Hitler almost seems like a little kind of monster movie or something, where it was a little more banal, I think, and so it became sort of less of a gripping story in some way for the way communist the USSR killed people. And by the way, communism also didn't work out very well in Mao's China, where just tons and again tens of millions of people dead. Pol Pot, and it goes on and on. Lots of death and lots of different kinds of cultures. Doesn't seem to work. When you try to make people just equal, they're not, and it stifles them, and it just doesn't allow enough sort of ventilation for people to kind of live various kinds of lives. And I do think capitalism, for all its faults, so far the best system we've come up with. And again, we always have to temper it with a certain amount of socialism too, which is the trick. But anyway, enough about that. The rights revolutions, I think, was the last sort of little sort of threshold events. He considered this was, again, civil rights, and then followed by women's rights and gay rights, and kind of valuing the rights and the lives of individuals over the elevated the state and the exaltation of the state. Anyway, so those were the sort of threshold moments through history. And again, this was a ton of research by a really eminent professor and scholar who's again, probably one of the definitely 10 and maybe 3 or 4 most accomplished scholars in the country in the last 50, 75 years. The pacifying, a few main forces that sort of help bring this about. I've gotten into it a little bit. The state being one, and again, once you have a state and a government that people can kind of trust, law and order is the first thing. And again, you're seeing some microcosmic examples of this in some of the riots we've had. What was it, Chad or something, or Chaz or something? This little 6-block area or something. I think it was Seattle, either Portland or Seattle. I think it was Seattle, where they kind of declared their own sort of statehood, and the mayor kind of backed off and let them do that. And they were immediately having problems and people were getting killed and so when you do have even as bad as, and again I get the African Americans, there's a minority populations like especially namely African Americans in our country with problems with say how they're policed, and some of it's understandable, but even so bad corrupt police is still so much better than no police. And the problems that arise from this one kills that, this one kills this one or this tribe. By the way, you still see this when they study small scale societies now. There's not too many of them left, but some of the like the Yanomami tribe in South America and things like that, where they very much basically the young girls by the time they turn 14 or 15, if they don't have strong fathers, physically strong, I mean, and brothers, or they can form alliances with other men and have some sort of male protection, they're constantly getting raped. And also, then what happens is a girl gets raped, her brother maybe goes and kills a guy from that. If it was the tribe next door, they come and then kill him in revenge, who then his two people. Anyway, these little wars are constantly sort of breaking out. Now, they never have huge, at some point they have a little war where it's like 5-on-5 or 10-on-10 or whatever it is, and they just sort of have it out. And after that, there's usually some sort of brokered peace. So in some ways, it was a little more similar and worked out than some, say World War I was in Europe. But still, just because what it is the constant when you have no major sort of state authority, this monopolizing violence. Okay, only they have the right to do violence on someone. It just dampens down so much of the little, once you have 10,000 people or more, right? So many of the little fights that end up killing people, and just make, even with all the problems police sometimes have, it's still way better than a society run on, basically protecting one's own and looking out for yourself, and, the revenge killings that come with that. Commerce was one of the other major pacifying forces. And again, that is, once people are trading with each other, they're not nearly as likely to want to kill each other. I mean, the reason the United States and China are probably not going to have a hot war, or at least it doesn't look like it right now, and there's a lot of factors that would make you think that we sort of should historically, but because we owe them, they rely on us economically, and we kind of rely on them too. We're interdependent on each other. Commerce, again, you're much more interested in trading with someone. As once you're trading with somebody, you're not nearly as likely that you're invested with them. You've gotten to know them. You're not nearly as likely to kill them. They don't seem so other, which is something we need to do to kill our fellow human beings often. And also, it's a game everyone can win, and even with all the unfairness, and there's plenty of it in our system, right? It's still so much better than being born. I mean, the name Smith, right? Very common. All come from blacksmiths and shoes, and that anyway. That's you were born a blacksmith. Your father was a blacksmith. His father, and you're stuck being, and there's nowhere to go for you, right? For somebody, all capitalism's problems, and it does need to be ventilated. Let's just say a little bit better. Give people, we need to make it a little easier for people to climb, which is something that we've got a little sclerotic, I think, in our society that way. But it's still commerce, absolutely trade, definitely makes things less people, and dampens down violence in humanity in general. Cosmopolitanism was another major force, and that is when you get cities and a lot of people living together, they all sort of get to know each other. We start to have more value differences in people, and especially acknowledge the samenesses, the similarities of us, and that was his last point. But anyway, this was just a blitzkrieg of research and a humongous amount of it and he really what Pinker does so well is kind of organize all this, kind of get it into a very sort of a cohesive and understandable narrative. And again, at the time, his view has become, most of my students, when I ask them if they think the world has gotten more violent in the last 10, 15 years, do say they know it hasn't, or they know it's been getting less violent. In our country, it kind of traces back to around 1994, when there seemed to be this sort of the end of the crack epidemic, in a lot of cities in this country. It seemed to roll back. But anyway, he organizes it amazingly well, and it sort of interprets it all in a very, very smart way. Anyway, that's Steven Pinker's Violence Vanquished, and see you in a bit.